Good evening, and welcome to episode 75 of the Political Mic Podcast. This is a very special episode because I have with me Professor Harold McDougall, who has been a member of the Howard faculty since 2000, teaching courses on property, sustainable development, and civil rights. He has a background in civil rights and community organizing and has served the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, as Washington Bureau Chief and the National Conference of Black Lawyers as UN Delegate. He has served on the National Governing Board of Common Cause, the Board of Directors of the Council for the International Exchange of Scholars, a Fulbright Scholars Program, and the Board of Trustees of the Paul J. Acker Foundation, Study Circles Resource Center, and Everyday Democracy. He has consulted for the Kellogg, Kettering, and Village Foundations and the Montgomery County, Maryland County Executive's Office. A Fulbright alumnus, he was granted a Fulbright Alumni Initiatives Award for his work on sustainable development in Jamaica. Professor McDougall specializes in civic culture and civic infrastructure, focusing primarily on how these support sustainable social and economic development and human rights. Professor McDougall has written several books pursuing these themes, as well as numerous articles and Huffington Post blogs. And today, Professor McDougall is going to shed some light on where the mental health crisis and politics, public policy intersect or collide. Professor McDougall, it's a privilege and honor to have you with me, sir.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so proud of you, and the work that you're doing. It's very, very high level. It's fantastic stuff.
Thank you so much. And of course, I've had the privilege and honor of having you as my civil rights planning professor. One of my favorite courses, leaving Howard University School of Law, and that's always something that I'll cherish. But I want to dive right in because you're right. Well, this research has been compiled into an article that will be published in the new Howard Law Civil Rights Law Journal. Am I correct?
Yeah, the Human and Civil Rights Law Review.
I'm sorry. And so, this is interesting because as we're talking about mental health, I was looking at a study done by Johns Hopkins Medicine, and it reported that mental health disorders account for several of the top causes of disabilities in established market economies such as the United States worldwide, and include major depression, also called clinical depression, manic depression, also called bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and obsessive compulsive disorder. An estimated 26% of Americans ages 18 and older, about 1 in 4 adults, suffers from a mental disorder in any given year. An estimated 26% of Americans ages 18 and older, about 1 in 4 adults, suffers from a diagnosable mental disorder in any given year. Many people suffer from more than one mental disorder at a given time. And so when I looked at the Kennedy School's research, it showed that young Americans are reporting an increase in mental health concerns, and politics and the media are at least partially to blame. And they said that the semi-annual study revealed that the school's Institute of Politics found that nearly half of 18 to 29-year-olds believe politics and or the news media has had a negative effect on their mental health. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that more than 1/3 of high school students said they suffered poor mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, while nearly half persistently felt sad or hopeless in 2021. And that was continuing a rise that began before the pandemic. Professor McDougall, can you shed some light on some information and research that you have compiled in the article and how it relates to what we're seeing in statistics after statistics that show that mental health is increasingly becoming something that more and more young people and adults are grappling with?
Well, I mean, Michael, you did a wonderful job of kind of sketching, the map of what's going on, and that all of us are finally beginning to wake up and see, what's going on. I would add to some of you stuff that you've said that apparently uh, mental health, kind of issues and disorders and things now account for 1/3 of all adult health problems worldwide. So what's happening in the United States? There's ripples. The United States gets a cold, everybody else gets pneumonia. Um, let me kind of share with you just some analytical tools that I've discovered as I probed this story and figured out what's going on. One of the most important things is something that's called polyvagal theory. This has to do with what's called the vagus nerve. There's a guy named Steve Borges or Porges who wrote about polyvagal theory. And basically, what he's saying is that the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in your body. It stretches from your brain all the way to your feet. It attaches to all of your vital organs. The vagus nerve is the location of the fight or flight syndrome. So the vagus nerve, when your psyche or your body or your mind or your spirit or whatever it is anticipates life-threatening danger, the vagus nerve sets everything in motion. Your blood pressure goes up, the blood goes to your extremities so that you can fight or you can flee, right? um, Two things about that. One is that there's a third modality. It's called freeze. You may see like a deer, like you're driving down the road and the deer sees you, you're coming too fast for it to run. You're too big for it to fight. So it freezes. And its strategy is it's hoping that that you don't really want to kill it and that you'll drive around or something like that. So fight, flight, or freeze. The problem is that modern society is giving us cues all of the time that our lives are in danger. From the news, from our friends. Uh, you take the bar exam. You've been trained to experience the bar exam as it was so important that your life depends on it, and you get that message, and your body says, "Oh yeah, your life does depend on it," and it sets all of these things in motion. It gets your heart rate up. Your liver, your kidneys, everything is all revved up. And it leads to there's a guy named Gabor Mate, a doctor, a medical doctor in Canada, who's really done a lot of work on this. And he basically says that these kinds of incidents result in inflammation. The inflammation can result in physical disease, and it can also result in mental instability. So basically, we're getting a lot of messages that our lives are in danger when they're not really. And so, fight, that gets triggered. Fight, that's violence, that's irritation, that's anger. Flee, that's anxiety, that's stress. Freeze, that's depression. So what you're talking about, the phenomena that we're all seeing, are actually in some ways normal reactions to an abnormal situation. Our social structures are very hierarchical. They're very top down, command and control. We're always angling to get find our place in the system. And the system tells us that unless we behave, unless we do exactly what the system wants us to do, our lives, our functional lives, our real lives are in danger. And our bodies take that message and they take it as if it was true. So we're getting more and more stressed out. And our physical responses. The thing I want to kind of focus on here is that what we call mental disorder is in very, very real ways a natural reaction to the unnatural stresses to which we are exposed.
That's a perfect segue because I wanted to uh, get you to elaborate a little bit more. I know in the article you had mentioned that social and environmental stressors could intensify a vulnerability that someone may have. Say someone inherits a gene that makes them predisposed to developing some symptoms of a mental disorder. Could you elaborate on how those social and environmental stressors could intensify that vulnerability if someone inherits a gene that makes their brains more vulnerable to develop such abnormalities?
Right. The thing that I want to keep focusing is that what we call abnormality is the abnormality isn't in the way that people behave or the way they react. The abnormality is in the stresses and the messages that they're receiving. The kinds of mental disturbances and things like that that we see become more and more commonplace are very uncommon among indigenous people and folks who basically lead simpler lives. So keep that in mind. The genetic markers that you're talking about, our brains begin to grow while we're still in the womb, and they basically grow until we're about 29 or 30. The cells are growing. Um, we're pruning certain neurons. There's neurons. There's glial cells. That's kind of the glue that holds everything together. There's capillaries that provide the blood. That supports the brain. Um, Everybody's brain is different, almost like everybody's fingerprint is different. So we're growing, we're pruning cells, we're adding cells. From the time that we're in the womb till we're about like 29 or 30. Um, Now, what can happen is that particularly severe stresses like environmental stuff, pollution, noise. It's hard for you to sleep. Absence of food insecurity. These kind of physical things. But then on the other hand, you have racism, homophobia, extreme political people getting worked up. Kind of in extreme political views. All those kinds of things are sending messages to the vagus nerve. And while this is going on, if it's going on during the time that we're growing, from the time that, some of these stressors that we're talking about, I talk about the womb, our brains are developing in the womb. Our mothers are exposed to these kinds of stressors, environmental pollution on the one hand, social pollution on the other. They're exposed to that. And that gets transmitted in her system into us. So, these kinds of stresses, environmental and social, can kind of skew our actual physical development. So as we get older, and the real symptoms don't really seem to appear till around puberty, 14, 15, 16, like that. And then they kind of escalate and reach a crescendo, like when we're about, in our mid 20s, late 20s, things like that. That's when most cases of neurodivergence, is the word we use now, really begin to manifest themselves. So the environmental and social stressors have an effect on the way that our brains actually grow. And they also obviously have an effect by exacerbating what our brains do when we're responding to stress.
And so you used a term that I wanted to get some more light on, because for those who may be wondering what neurodiversity is, in layman's terms, could you explain what that term means?
Well, it's like I say, everybody's brain is different, like a fingerprint. Um, there are. Let me give you an example. Well, I mean, the kind of the vagus nerve stuff that I talked about, that's common to everybody. I mean, we're all responding to it. If we develop in think about neurodiversity as a spectrum, almost like the autism spectrum. Some of us are, for example, much more anxious. Every kind of feature that we have, I want to say that it's not really abnormal. It serves a purpose, but it may be that in a particular social context that we are in, that purpose is not there to be served. So, for example, you might have a high level of anxiety. Now, there's a yin and yang to that. The good news is you're always ready for an emergency. The bad news is you're always ready for an emergency. You see what I'm saying? So, it's like each one of these kind of like there's a law student, a young law student at Howard right now, who has started something that she calls the Atypical Law Students Organization. Also, it's basically as a meeting place for students who are on the autism spectrum, OCD, nonverbal learning disorder, um, attention deficit disorder, things like that. One of the things that's really interesting about these particular aspects of neurodivergence is that they very often are accompanied by very high levels of intelligence. Um, we have this whole kind of picture of the madman genius, right? He's a madman here, he's a genius there. There's, in a way, there's something to that. Um, a genius, for example, has the ability to see connections that other people don't see. If the connections that this person sees are connections that the rest of the world appreciates, you're a genius. If they don't appreciate it, you're crazy, right? So keep reminding yourself that everything that we see going on here has a social context and obviously an environmental context in terms of air pollution and droughts and floods and fire and all that kind of stuff. All of that affects the way that we perceive the world and the way that our brains respond to the world that we perceive. That's kind of the important thing. But the neurodivergence, I'm kind of get off that point a little bit. The neurodivergence is a way, the spectrum of neurodiversity is a way of describing the different kinds of sensitivities that we develop as we grow. Somebody has an anxiety disorder, but it can also, somebody with that anxiety disorder can anticipate danger before it comes and save your life. There's a variety of OCD. Somebody who has OCD is like, we have this caricature of people kind of constantly writing, the same thing over and over and over again. But sometimes people with OCD can bring levels of concentration to a problem that nobody else can bring. And so it has, again, there's a yin and a yang to all of these things. What makes them scary or dangerous or not appreciated is the social context in which they occur.
And so, in the article, Professor, you had mentioned that a lack of physical safety can actually worsen hallucinations and paranoia and actually increase depression. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to just take a footnote on in terms of like schizophrenia, for example, um, the vagus nerve stuff, the anxiety, the stress, the violence, the depression, those are all things that all of us experience at some point or another. But not all of us are hearing voices. Not all of us are having auditory and visual hallucinations. Apparently, there is a significant percentage of the human population that hears voices and or has either auditory and or visual hallucinations, a significant percentage of the population that is uniform throughout the human race, regardless of your nationality, of your ethnic origin, the part of the world that you live in. So scientists are beginning to think that this thing about hearing voices and seeing visual hallucinations and stuff like that, that is something that actually served a purpose in our human background. I'm not talking about Neanderthals. I'm talking about Homo sapiens. This served a purpose in our development, and because of the way that our society is developed and kind of where we are right now, that purpose is no longer served. But remind yourself, our species has only been on the planet for 200,000 years. I mean, the human beings have been on the planet for 5 million. So we really are quite new compared to the other species, who are all gone now, but, we're the only ones left. But we're actually still quite new. So we haven't had time really to genetically remove that particular trait, which had a purpose at one point. There's still kind of folklore and even some traditions left that are connected to that. In Northeast Asia, there is a tradition of what they call shamans, S-H-A-M-A, and shaman. Some people call them witch doctors, things like that in other cultures. But the shaman, the word actually means wounded healer. So somebody in the Northeast Asian indigenous tribes, like 1,000 years ago, they've done the research on this, might be exhibiting characteristics of what we would call schizophrenia, hearing voices, seeing hallucinations. They would be, first of all, nobody's scared of that. It's something that's common enough. So they would send them out into the wilderness to figure it out. And because of the fact that high IQ tends to connect with this, they would usually figure it out. And they would come back and they would have lessons for the whole tribe, for example. You know, somebody might be having a reaction because of their neurodiversity. They have a particularly acute sensitivity to changes in barometric pressure, right? I mean, you know people who get headaches even now when the barometric pressure changes. Well, that's a very useful for predicting when it's going to rain or when a storm is going to come. That's a very useful trait for the tribe. So they're looking at people who have exceptional, they call them gifts. I mean, exceptional kinds of features. There must be a reason for this, and they look for that. In fact, Gabor Mate, in an interview that he did for Democracy Now! A couple of days ago, was saying that he had he's also a psychiatrist. He had a friend who's a Lakota Sioux who is a psychiatrist. And he said in their tradition, when somebody in their tribe manifests depression or anxiety or even schizophrenia, the tribe thanks them. Why do they thank them? Thanks them because this person is letting the community know that there's some level of social disturbance in the community that has caused the person to react like this. And so as a community, we take responsibility. Very, very different from the way that we approach these things in the United States.
So I do want to ask, being that this is a political platform, if you, in your professional experience and in the research that you've conducted, if you have seen any kind of correlation between those who maybe exhibiting some of these symptoms that we've been discussing this evening, and why, or those symptoms making them predisposed to support someone like a Donald Trump, who seems to have such a strong base that even in light of lack of evidence of any kind of, I guess, any kind of serious attempt to change the outcome of the election, they seem to latch on to this belief that the 2020 election was stolen. Letitia James, an alum of Howard University School of Law, has now filed a $250 million lawsuit for his practices in New York State because of his tax fraud and exaggerating his assets and everything like that. And the response from the right is that this is a witch hunt. They're out to get him. Don't they have anything better to do with their time? This is a politically motivated investigation. Are there any kind of correlations between those kinds of symptoms and political preferences and choices of Americans?
Well, I can speculate. I mean, I can't get inside people's heads, but I would say this. Life in America, for many people, has gotten increasingly stressful. There was a kind of golden age, and it's not like the Wild West or stuff like that. The golden age of the United States was 1945 to 1970. This was a time when people were coming home from the war. There was a lot of development. Europe's manufacturing and productive capacity had been decimated by the war. China's had not yet developed. Japan, two H bombs, atomic bombs. Nobody was really in a position to produce the way we were. And we're a big country. So between 1945 and 1970, there's blue collar jobs, like in factories where people make enough money to send their kids to college. They get 2 cars, they get the house in the suburb. It's fantastic. But by around 1970, the rest of the world starts catching up. And the manufacturing industry in the United States, first of all, moves from the North and the Midwest to the South. In the South, you had a lot of what are called right to work laws. These made it very, very difficult to unionize. So the manufacturers first moved from the North and the Midwest to the South because they're not going to deal with unions. They're going to be able to pay their workers less. That goes on for a while. Then manufacturing capacity by investment by these same corporations and also by the countries that are hosts begins to emerge, like in Mexico and China and Southeast Asian places like that. American manufacturing now moves out of the South into these locations where they can pay people even less. What happens? Those blue collar jobs, that that wonderful kind of 25, year, kind of golden age where everybody's making money. It seems possible. Everybody's can go to college. It's fantastic. It's all of a sudden it's gone. Um, and in the meantime, the Chinese, for example, are investing in their manufacturing capacity at a rapid pace. Now when we're not going to catch up with them. I mean, they've got huge factories. They're also investing in their workforce. They're training their workforce. Where am I going with this? So this Make America Great Again is really more about that particular period, right? It's not like the Civil War. It's not all that kind of stuff. It's like that time when we had economic power. And as that thing begins to collapse, somehow wealth in the United States begins to migrate upward so that we have fewer and fewer very, very wealthy people. The middle class is beginning to disappear. The working class, very, very low wages, things like that. So that's very stressful. And we've already talked about that vagus nerve, right? So that vagus nerve now, people who have the perception that the lives that they knew are disappearing, are experiencing that as a threat to their very existence. And their vagus nerves are going into overdrive, and we're getting irritation, we're getting violence, we're getting stress, we're getting depression. Now, that's also a perfect scenario in which somebody can come in with a story that makes sense out of all of this, even though it's like, cockamamie from any kind of perspective. As long as it makes sense, it's going to make people feel better. And if the story makes them feel better, it explains some major kind of disaster or hurt that they feel that they've experienced. They're liable to latch onto it. Now, another word for this is a con game. I mean, this is how that goes. But I think that's kind of what's going on. I think the people who are responding in the way that you describe, I think are very, very stressed out because the lives that they knew are gone. And the con men are basically saying, we have somebody that you can blame for this. And by blaming somebody else for what happened, your stress is going to be relieved.
So, Professor, why is it that behavioral health care is not that accessible for many Americans?
Well, a lot of reasons. One is that this kind of explanation that I've given to you about what it actually is something that is not generally marketed and presented to people. Um, there's a pharmacological industry that has part of the answer. This vagus nerve business, it sets your hormones kind of going, serotonin, all these kind of different hormones get racing because of the response to stress that your body is creating in you. Those hormones and chemicals in your body are racing around. Now, the pharmacological industry has figured out a way to give you medicine or chemicals that affect the trajectory of those hormones. The problem is there's two problems. One is that those medicines tend to have severe side effects. The other one is, and it isn't really addressing the problem. The problem is the stress that you're experiencing and the way your body is responding to them. What the chemicals do, the medicine does, is it tempers your body's response, but it doesn't change the stressors that your body is responding to. It doesn't change your vagus nerve, things like that. So there's a lot of money to be made, in this industry, and prices are going up. It's very tempting when people feel that they can't do without a particular medication to increase the price. This is the way this particular economy works. Same thing with practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists. You know, people just desperate for this stuff, just charge them a little bit more, charge them a little bit more, charge them a little more. Next thing you know, they're charging you like $800 and $900 an hour. So what's happening with the practitioners? I talked to you about the medicine. With respect to the practitioners, first of all, the demand is increased. The pandemic, really exacerbated all of this stuff. but the demand has increased, and so there's just not enough of them to go around, and they're raising their prices. Some of them no longer take insurance. The insurance that they accept very often doesn't cover, the whole thing. So you've got this kind of crisis that is growing and picking up speed at the same time that the structures that are in place to respond to it are taxed, to the limit. Again, high level practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists are retiring. They're not taking insurance, and not enough new people are being trained. So there's a real supply and demand kind of problem in the whole kind of behavioral health industry.
And so, one of the solutions I believe you advocate for in the article for the law review is that um, is a robust system of community-based behavior. Now, could you explain how a robust system of community-based behavior would solve or address adequately the limitations of both professional behavioral health system and the emergency responders to meet
Wow.
existing needs?
Okay, that's really kind of two separate things. They're interrelated, but let me kind of try to work that. So the first thing is that let me go with the crisis management stuff first. Because of the dearth of supply of medicine and of providers, you know, a lot of people just not getting treated. So you have the situation where people are going into emergency rooms, and the emergency rooms are filled to capacity. First of all, the pandemic, but now you have all of these folks who are stressed out by the pandemic, plus by the climate instability that we're all responding to, the political instability that we're all responding to. So it's kind of a perfect storm, and people are beginning to flock into the emergency rooms. They get in there, they have to first of all be examined physically. Is there a heart problem? Is there a thought? All that stuff. And they're in there for days, right? And in the meantime, there's somebody, waiting who actually has a heart problem who can't get in as a result. So you've got this thing. So what you want on the one hand is a system of what are called, what we call urgent care centers. These are already, growing up all over the country for primary care, for physical health. You go to the urgent care, you go to the minute clinic, to get a shot, or to have somebody, check your, your mouth, see if you got a sore in there. You don't have to go into the hospital for that. There's a lot of things that you can be treated for physically in an urgent care setting, which means you don't have to go into the hospital. That's a great thing because that leaves space for the people who actually have to go to the hospital. The problem has been that those urgent care centers were only focused on physical health. There is now legislation that has authorized federally qualified health centers to offer kind of basic behavioral health care as well. So you now have urgent care centers that are under this federally qualified, kind of legislation, where you might have, rather than a psychologist, you might have a clinically trained social worker. You don't have to go quite so far in school to get this degree. You can handle basic stuff, and it's all what most people need. You also have what they call psychiatric nurse practitioners who are not psychiatrists. You don't have to go to medical school for years and years and years, but you can be trained well. You can be trained to handle medication, prescribe doses, all that kind of stuff. So there are already, like for example, in Maryland, in Howard County, I think, for example, there's like 10 or 11 of these hybrid urgent care centers already. That's a very, very good sign that responds to the problem of the dearth of psychiatrists and psychologists. It also responds to the emergency room problem. Just go to the urgent care. They're not going to keep you there, for something that isn't connected to what you're doing. So that's the community-based structure that we need to help people when they have these kinds of issues. Right now, crisis management, we have crises because we don't have enough of these kind of urgent care centers that people can go to. So somebody's having a nervous breakdown or whatever it is, and they're in crisis. And there's not enough psychiatrists, there's not enough psychologists. You know, the emergency room is the only place people know to go. And so um, folks will tend to call the police, and they'll say, okay, we've got somebody here who's really upset. You know, they're punching holes in the wall. You know, and again, this is vagus nerve stuff, mind you. You know, this isn't like the stigma vision of what behavioral health problems are.
Right.
You know, this is like this is something that could happen to any of us,
Mhm.
right? And that scares people when you say that, because they're thinking, oh, you know, you're possessed by the devil or something like that. And I can talk to you about that, you know, also, but stick with the point. So they call the police. The police are trained to handle dangerous folks. And these people aren't really dangerous. In fact, statistics indicate that mentally ill, behaviorally, you know, just divergent people are much more likely to be victims of violence than to be perpetrators. That is exactly contrary to what most people believe, but that's what the facts, you know, kind of show. So one of the companion innovations to these urgent care centers is what are called mobile crisis teams. These are folks who are maybe a clinically trained social worker, what are called peer counselors, people who have experienced behavioral health issues and have managed to work them out, transcend them. They come along as well. In a number of places, a mobile crisis team, when the police are called, and it's reported as a behavioral health issue, the police they come out with the mobile crisis team. The police handle any danger that's involved, but as far as talking the person down, um, giving them some advice on what you take next. Did you take your medication today? You know, do you feel threatened? Do you feel scared? You know, things like that. That kind of stuff, which is kind of rudimentary psychotherapy, the mobile crisis team takes care of. So you have this pattern now that's beginning to be developed, where when the police are called, the mobile crisis team comes with them. There's a new innovation, the 988 number, that is sponsored by President Biden in his new legislation, where you call now. You don't call if there's a situation developing that you don't think you can handle. You don't call 911. You call 988. And what you get is a mobile crisis team, and they only bring the police. They only call the police if it appears as if there's a real, kind of dangerous situation emerging. So you have mobile crisis teams to handle emergencies, and you have the urgent care centers developing in a more robust pattern, so that the the actual emergencies are fewer and fewer.
And so one of the things you also discuss is how homelessness is basically a byproduct of a lack of treatment options. And so, could I ask you, how is it that a lack of treatment options results in an amplification of the likelihood that mentally ill individuals will end up homeless on the street or incarcerated?
Well, there's two things about that. One of them is historical. Um, you know, up until like the 1950s and 1960s, the old kind of vision of what mental illness, behavioral health issues, neurodivergence, what that was, it was still kind of carried over from the early days of the I'll just say the monotheistic religions, that when people heard voices or had hallucinations, unlike the shaman, unlike the Northeast Asian tribes that experience these people as they're hearing these things, they're seeing these things because they have a particular sensitivity to some disturbance in the environment, and we need that tracking ability from them. You have monotheistic religions that are hierarchical in nature, and the idea is that you don't speak to God, you speak to the priest. The priest speaks to God for you, and so there's levels. And like in the Catholic Church, for example, you got all these different levels of authority. Those monotheistic religions, when they're first being kind of put together, they experience as very threatening any person who seems to speak to some kind of supernatural energy or force without the intervention of a person who's part of their system. That still kind of affect that that still kind of affects our vision of what behavioral health issues are to this day. And there's a lot of people who are still kind of in that old mindset, haven't been exposed to the physiological examination of what is actually happening, in our bodies and in our minds as these things, kind of continue. So up until about the 1950s, anybody who exhibited any kind of behavioral health issues, they basically put you in a prison. They were called insane asylums, but the distinction between that and a prison was like, on apples and oranges. I mean, you're restricted, drugged out of them, just really drugged so they could barely move. John Kennedy comes along. He says, this is really very kind of medieval. We need to stop this. So basically, he gets legislation passed like 62, 63. He's, like almost like his last year before he's assassinated. He gets legislation passed that is designed to shut all these things down and decentralize the behavioral health population into the community, and doing pretty much what I just said. The whole kind of urgent care, all that was part of the plan. He was assassinated. I don't know if that explains what happened, but funding for these asylums got cut because of the legislation that Kennedy got through. So the asylums shut down. The only problem is that the community care centers that he envisioned did not materialize, partly because there was still a lot of this stigma going on. And the word NIMBY, NIMBY, means not in my backyard. So there's a lot of that going on in communities. Oh, I don't want these people who think they're Bonaparte and they're going to shoot me, that kind of stuff. Those cartoon, kind of versions of what behavioral health issues are. So nobody wanted. So what happens? The insane asylums close down. People are put out of the things, but they have no place to go. The homeless population increases by about 30 or 40%. And to this day, about a third of the homeless population are people with behavioral health issues. Now, it isn't just this wholesale shutting down of the insane asylums. What happens now is that people have loved ones with behavioral health issues in their own homes. And it's very, very difficult to manage, keep them safe, very difficult. So you have the emergence of, group homes and, things like that. But those, just like the supply and demand, just like the psychiatrists and the psychologists and the medication prices and stuff like that, there's just not enough to go around. So people they feel they can't keep their loved ones safe in their own homes anymore. And the system is saying your loved one is not eligible for a group home unless they legally cannot live with you. So you have to evict them. You actually have to go to court and get your loved one evicted from your house. Take that eviction notice to the group home, and they say, okay, now we'll, but then, we had 2 spaces, but now they're gone. So your loved one is evicted. There's no place to go. Increase in the homeless population that way as well.
So, for folks, as it pertains to folks I talked to who lived in the 1960s, it seems to me that the 1960s was a time when you should have had the government. I mean, this is a time when the Great Society programs came right after Jack Kennedy's assassination in 63. Lyndon Johnson, of course, goes to the Senate and pledges to commit himself, his presidency, to the fulfillment of Jack Kennedy's legacy. And that's how we get programs like PBS, NPR, food stamps, Head Start. Why is it that during the 1960s, we actually see budget cuts in both state and federal funding for mental health programs? I mean, we're talking about the psyche of the nation just going through a real toll after the assassination. Then Vietnam. Yeah. You would think this would be a time when mental health would take priority right among Medicare and Medicaid. Why is it that we saw budget cuts?
The only explanation I can give you is that the science hadn't caught up yet. I mean, like the vagus, this Peter Borges, and analysis of the vagus nerve, that's like decades away. This is the stuff I've been describing to you is stuff that's only emerged like in the last 20 years, right? So my sense of it is that while people are ready to accept black people, people are ready to think about immigrants. People don't understand that Lyndon Johnson did amazing work legislatively. Um, he reformed the immigration laws. The immigration laws basically were designed so that if you weren't from Northern Europe, you had a rough time getting in here. But there were changes made, like if there was a member of the family here, you could unite the family. All kinds of stuff happened. This the kind of large influx of immigrants that the right wing in particular complains about. They I hate to give this bone to them, but you can blame Lyndon Johnson for that. I mean, he got that law changed, and it was the right thing to do. But I think because the understanding of what the term neurodivergence is only like 2 or 3 years old itself. The idea that things that have frightened us have have real rational explanations, is something that we just weren't there yet, man. I mean, we're ready to smoke reefer, we're ready to go to Woodstock, we're ready to accept black people, we're ready to say no more war, no more nukes, but people who are insane, oh, that's scary. I don't think I can manage that. That's my only explanation. We just were not mature enough. We were not developed enough at that time. We are now. The problem is now we don't have the resources that we had in the 1960s.
And so you also talked about President Carter. You fast forward to the late 70s. We're in 1977 now. President Carter has a presidential commission that's aimed at addressing mental illness. But I want to ask, why was the system of community-based care and treatment for persons with serious mental illness under President Carter's presidential commission, which was, call for us to take mental health seriously? Why was that never taken? Why did that never take into fruition?
Well, a couple of things. One is to just observe that, Jimmy Carter is like an amazing person. I mean, we talk about Kennedy all the time, and Carter seems to be like kind of this. In Ghana, there's a term, in Africa, Ghana particularly, there's a term small boy. It's like compared to Kennedy, Carter's a small boy. I disagree. I mean, I saw Carter and his wife working, rolling up their sleeves and working like in homeless shelters and, how, housing initiatives. I mean, actually physically there. I mean, stuff you would never see people like this do. So, I mean, hats off to him. He had the right idea. But there's a couple things. One is he only had one term. And, the ending of his term was kind of suspicious. That's that whole kind of Iran-Contra, piece that went on down there. I mean, I think that, Carter was just too progressive for the time. And, I mean, Reagan gets elected in 1980. That's the beginning of the neoliberal and right-wing shift, in this country. If you look at, I mean, it kind of all starts with Nixon. You go to 1968, Nixon's running for president. And, it's the civil rights movement is kind of on a downward slide. Black power is now out, black nationalism, people are scared, stuff like that, black power. And what's his name? The George Wallace, governor of Alabama. They'll never outsig me again. Like he's going to stand in the in the doorways to keep black people out of the colleges and stuff. He runs as a third party candidate. He gets a larger percentage of the vote than any third party candidate in history up until that time, running on a purely racist platform. The only candidate who got more votes than him was Teddy Roosevelt when he ran on something called the Bull Moose Party. But he had already been president as a Republican, right? So I think he got like 19% or something like that. And Wallace gets 14%. Nixon looks at that. He says, "Wow, if we could get that 14% into the Republican Party, we'd have an unbeatable majority for the presidency." It's called the Southern Strategy. He actually announced it at the National Press Club. He could play the piano. He announces it. He's playing "I Wish I Was in Dixie" on the piano, and Spiro Agnew, who could sing, is singing the words "I Wish I Was in Dixie." And that became the Southern strategy. And, there's a way in which Trump is kind of like the ultimate, kind of fruition of that. But with that Southern strategy between 1968 and 2008, that's 40 years. That's 10 presidential administrations. 7 of them are Republican. You got Obama. No, I'm sorry. You have Clinton twice and Carter once. That's 3. Before, until Obama's elected, you got 7 out of 10. That's a pretty good batting average. And then you take a look at the Supreme Court. Every time you're in the White House, you get to, I'm kind of divergent. I mean, it's a whole political stuff. But I guess what I'm saying is that the answer to your question is that Jimmy Carter had the right idea. He wasn't president long enough to make it happen.
So I want to ask you about the recent legislation that was passed this summer, the gun bill that was passed by President Biden. There's been a lot of talk from the Republican side about how, the phenomena of mass shooting after mass shooting, from schools to grocery stores. Uvalde was the latest big mass shooting, and this gun bill was a direct reaction to the frustration that people feel, the fatigue around this issue. And all we've been hearing from the Obama administration until now is this is about mental health.
Yeah.
Well, the gun bill finally has some provisions in mental health, and I want to get your take on whether or not these provisions are strong enough. There are those who, on the progressive side of the political spectrum, who argue that this bill, while it's good to have a legislative victory for political reasons, does not nearly go far enough. I want to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't know if this is going to be what you're looking for, but to me, it's not about mental health. It's about stress. I mean, I think that, it's that same thing I was telling before about make America great again. Give me back what's been taken from me. Give me back what's been taken from me, because I feel like my life depends on it. Uh-oh, vagus nerve. Did you say your life depends on it? Let's send your blood pressure up. Let's send all of the, energy out to your external organs. Let's, kind of take stuff away from your brain other than violence, stress, anxiety, depression. And then you have a society in which you can get a gun, I don't know, easier they can get almost anything. And that's also, that's the gun industry. I think it's the level of stress that we're all subject to in this country because of the way we have mishandled our birthrights. And I'm not talking about, like it's your fault, it's my fault, it's that fault. It's the whole kind of way that we have organized our system in this kind of top-down command and control hierarchy where everybody's fighting to get to the top. And if you're down in the bottom, well, that's too bad for you, stuff like that. That's stressful. That's really stressful. And I think it's those levels of stress, depending upon people's, kind of brain development, we talked about that, you might be particularly susceptible to these kinds of things. But I think that if you just posit it as a mental issue, you're really missing the point. The point is that there's stuff going on in this country and in the world. I mean, like climate change, political instability. I mean, democracy is on the run in countries all over the world, right? That's crazy. I mean, that's talk about crazy. That's crazy. And that kind of thing makes people react very in anxiety, stress, anger, violence, depression, and then you can go into any Walmart and get a gun. I mean, I'm saying that we've created a very dangerous and volatile situation in this country, and we are also making guns available to anybody who wants them. So it isn't like only people who have certified like schizophrenia are going to be responsible for mass shootings. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's much more dangerous than that. And I think for that reason, the whole piece that nobody wants to talk about because the gun lobby has so much power in Congress, there's too many guns. I mean, there's just too many guns. It's just too easy to get a gun. And yeah, if you're really upset about something, you shouldn't have a gun in your hand. But we want to make sure that there's two sides. I want to kind of emphasize that there's two sides to this thing. One is the level of stress that we're all under, which is really what my article is about. And the other one is that it's just too easy to get a gun.
So, Professor, looking to the future, um, it just looks like this would just be a problem that would increase as there are more allegations of fraud for voter integrity coming out, and Trump seems to be, sowing the seeds for another run. And then you've got, like you mentioned, democracies across the board. I mean, Britain went through about four prime ministers in the span of 6 years. We've
Wow.
had January 6th here.
Yeah.
We've got Putin, investing secretly $300 million to influence democratic elections around the world. I mean, those are some stressful things. And so, moving forward, what are some federal and state public policy proposals that should be put forward, and what are the advantages?
I would add local to that, federal, state, and local. I have another article that came out about 6 months ago called "Think Nationally, Act Locally." One of the problems with progressive people right now is that because of a brief period between like 1950s, 1960s, where everything, civil rights movement, everything that progressive that you wanted to get done, you went to the federal government because people at the local level, they're racist, all this kind of stuff. It's not like that anymore. I mean, we've got some of the people that we were running from in the civil rights movement now are controlling the federal government. I mean, they're, so, and why is that? Because the states control how people vote. If you control the state legislature, you got a good, I mean, look at all the gerrymandering that's going on right now. You've got a good way to control the federal government. So in some ways, blue states and blue cities inside of red states are the most likely area to begin to respond to stuff. I mean, you look what happened. I mean, kudos to Biden to getting that thing passed. But look at what he had to go through with the senator from West Virginia. I mean, so yeah, I'd love to see some federal and state, legislation that would do things like increase access to healthcare, increase access to education, uh, minimize food insecurity, right? Reduce exposure to wildfires and drought and floods, those stressful events. I'd love to see all that happen on a federal and state level. But until that happens, I think we have to begin by building community. We have to make connections. We have to learn how to trust each other. And that's only going to happen in small settings, small groups, no more than 15 or 20 people at a time. Now, you get small groups like that. They're called study circles in Sweden. You get small groups like that. Yeah, there's empathy. You learn to trust people. You're really doing the good thing, cooperatives, stuff like that. But they're not big enough to respond to the scale of the problems that you're calling for federal and state legislation for. So what do? You link them up. You create what are called citizens' assemblies of lots and lots of small groups of people connected by dialogue with one another to have an authentic kind of small d democratic response to most of the things that threaten us. I think that's what has to happen.
So, Professor, in the closing few minutes of the program, I just want to open up the floor. If you had any other points that you wanted to hit home with.
Yeah, I would just say that just as the answer that I just gave you, community based, that's also the answer to the behavioral health issue, and the behavioral health issue can be resolved best by mainstreaming, by bringing people back into the community. Under conditions where folks are people's issues are managed, they're supported. There's something called Soteria House that was developed by an NIH guy in California in the 70s that basically enables people with behavioral issues to essentially rewire the connections that have been miswired because of a genetic or abnormality, or perhaps a genetic eccentricity. I don't want to say abnormality, eccentricity overlaid by racism, homophobia, bullying, environmental, pollution, things like that, can be rewired by loving, caring, supportive relationships. One of the things about that vagus nerve, there's one more piece to it. When you're in danger, you're like a mammal, right? Fight, flight, freeze, things like that. The way you feel safe is by rejoining the herd, rejoining the community. So what we want is ways for people with behavioral issues to become part of the community again. And Soteria House had this curriculum that they call being with and doing with. Being with, telling stories, and it was like it's a housing kind of development where you have peer counselors, clinically trained social workers, psychiatric nurse practitioners are there, but most of the work is being done by the people with the behavioral issues themselves. They're learning how to support each other. Oh, is that what happened to you? Well, this is what I did about that. Being with, doing with your, everyday chores. You're learning how to take care of yourself again. You're gardening, things like that. You're taking walks in nature. One of the things that we haven't even talked about, which is another whole article, is something that they call soft fascination. Science is beginning to show that our mental health can be greatly, greatly enhanced by just taking a walk in the park, by standing under a tree, by watching a deer cross the road. We are naturally connected to nature, but the way we live has unnaturally separated it from us.
Professor, I have thoroughly enjoyed this enlightening discussion. It added so much, I guess, perspective in terms of how we view those who we see as political enemies, and also ourselves, and how we perceive world events and things of that nature. But I just want to also allow you to just give a little tease about what's to come. I know this was just the initial episode to lay the foundation of this discussion, but you have some other panelists that are going to be joining us, I believe, for episode 76. Could you shed some light on what?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't confirmed with these folks yet, but everything that I've talked to you about, there's some expert who can drill down deeper in it than me. Like the crisis management thing, there's an experiment called GBRICS, Greater Baltimore Region Immediate Care System, something like that. That's going to go online, like within the next couple of weeks. Adrienne Burdenstein is the director of that. I'd really like her to get on here and talk to you about mobile crisis teams. They have mobile crisis teams with GPS trackers so that when the folks are going to get to your house. I mean, it's amazing stuff. There's a whole Soteria House movement nationwide, worldwide. People all over the world are trying to do exactly what I was talking about. Kathy Laws is like the honcho of that in the United States. I'd love to get her on here. And then there's a lot more people. We'll see how much time and space you have. But let me and also the law review is going to have a panel at Howard. Looks like now it's going to be like mid-November. Okay. And I'm thinking that some of these folks may be on the panel as well. And I can give you information on that. But Michael, as we close, I want to just kind of congratulate you again on the work you're doing, man. I mean, this is so professional. I mean, I feel like I'm on NBC or something like that. So it's terrific.
Thank you. And so, Professor McDougall, thank you so much. When is the article going to be published, by the way?
Early 2023.
Okay, early 2023.
But a draft of it is already up on the Social Sciences Research Network, SSRN. You can look it up under my name, Harold McDougall. It's called Neurodiversity and the Behavioral Health Dilemma. You can look it up and you can download like a draft of it. You can take a look at it. You have any comments, send them to me, and I'll try to incorporate them, when the piece is actually published officially in early 2023.
Excellent. So, Professor McDougall, thank you once again. I want to also encourage those, like I do every week, who view, who watch, who listen, tune in on a weekly basis, and who will go back and rewatch the program, to refrain from sketchy sources of news and challenge the sources of news that you do plug into. I also want to invite you to now subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn. On those major platforms for podcasts, The Political Mic is available. As always, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, join the conversation, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for your viewership. Thank you, Professor McDougall, for the knowledge that you imparted to us tonight. And I want to go ahead and conclude episode 75 of the Political Mic podcast. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks again.